I had been at Quimper 5 months, from mid-March until mid-August of 1943, when we received orders to move out. The Allies had landed in Sicily on July 10, 1943, and by August the situation there did not look promising for Toulouse. My new division was detached from the 6th Army and ordered to Italy as a precautionary measure. We loaded on trains at Quimper. The process of loading inexperienced, frightened and balky horses aboard trains with mostly inexperienced soldiers was as difficult as ever. We managed to overcome all the problems, however, and travelled from Quimper to Modane, Savoy, on the French-Italian border. We unloaded from the train at Modane and marched to the foot of the Alps, where we camped for the night. I was ordered to report to the tent of my battalion commander, Major Nickish, shortly after dusk. When I arrived, I found the other 2 battery commanders there as well. "We are going to march over the Alps, gentlemen," Nickish said. "The High Command has decided the risk that Italian partisans might have mined the train tunnel through the Alps and could blow it up with one of our trains inside is too great. They think it more prudent to march over the Alps in the open, where we can protect ourselves if necessary." This was going to be a tremendous feat. I returned to my command tent and called in my 2 officers, Lieutenant Destenberg and Lieutenant Uringer. I briefed them on the situation. We were to follow the route Hannibal took across the Alps with his elephants. Our horses had to pull very heavy guns and loaded ammunition carts and wagons. We were to march up to a pass at the crest of Mont Cenis and then down the other side into Italy. The Mont Cenis pass was approximately 2,100 metres high, and the road distance was about 28 kilometres. It was obviously going to be a Herculean task for our horses and for everyone concerned. I was up at 5 a.m. the next day to oversee preparations for the march. We moved out at 6 and began the arduous climb to the pass. We did not ride the horses, of course, or ride on the carts and wagons, but walked and led the horses. We moved on a modern road, but at times we could see the old Roman road Hannibal had taken across the Alps, because it often ran parallel to the road we were on. The horses strained in their harnesses to pull their heavy loads up the mountain. At least the road was paved and the wheels of the vehicles rolled easily. If it had been cross-country terrain, I do not think we would have had a realistic chance of making it. We stopped every 30 minutes for a break instead of every hour as we normally would. The weather was beautiful, with sunshine, clear air and bright skies. The area was also beautiful, with high mountains all around us. But the climb up the steep mountain road pulling their heavy loads was an extremely arduous task for the horses. 9 hours after we started in mid-afternoon, we finally reached the pass and the Italian border. We stopped by a small lake with crystal-clear water, where we fed and watered the horses and gave them 2 hours of rest before we began the descent down the other side of the mountain. We considered it a moral victory just to get all our guns and equipment up to the pass. From the pass, we could see all the way down the other side of the mountain with its winding road, hairpin turns and rushing whitewater creeks. We knew that going down was not going to be an easy task either. It should certainly be easier and faster than the trip up had been, but it would be much more treacherous. For the horses, going down the mountain could be both difficult and dangerous. Although the guns and other vehicles all had brakes, they were primitive brakes that consisted only of blocks of wood that rubbed against the wheels. Not only were they not terribly effective on a steep downhill grade, but they could also wear out quickly. Although the last 2 horses in the 6-horse team could help hold the vehicle back, they would not last long if the whole weight of the vehicle pushed into them, and they had to try to hold it back all by themselves. It was a tension-filled journey down the mountain for all of us, because we knew the danger only too well. By the time we reached the bottom, the trip over the Alps had become by far the most exhausting exercise any of us had ever experienced. We arrived at the bottom well after dark. We pitched our tents near the Italian town of Susa in a meadow surrounded by woods. A creek ran through the meadow, and the farers watered and washed the horses in the creek. My battery had 180 very tired men and 165 exhausted horses that night. It was probably midnight before we were all able to collapse in our tents and virtually pass out, We stayed at Susa all the next day to allow the aching bodies of the men and horses to rest. The men washed their clothes in the creek and wrote letters home. The weather was pleasant, and sleeping in tents was not a real hardship. Meanwhile, trains had been scheduled for the division, and the next day we boarded our train at Susa and went toward Piacenza. We unloaded from the train at Alessandria and marched to Piacenza. The Po River ran through Piacenza, and the bridges across the Po were strategically important because we needed them to get supplies to our forces in southern Italy. Our mission was to ensure that these bridges were secure. Italian soldiers guarded the bridges. We were there as a precaution, in case the Italians deserted us and dropped out of the war. We could not allow them to do that because it would expose all of southern Europe to attack by the Allies. Our advance people had arrived ahead of us, and all units had been assigned housing. My battery was in a village outside Piacenza. For the first few days, we lived in tents, under field conditions. Our forces around Piacenza included one infantry regiment and our artillery battalion. The rest of our division was at other bridges over the Po River. After the first few days, we moved from our tents into permanent quarters. We were issued the khaki uniform worn by Rommel's Africa Corps to replace our field grey uniforms. North Africa had been lost to the Allies, and the uniforms were now to be used in Italy. Piacenza was a picturesque city, a typical medieval Italian city with fortifications. It had been fortified for centuries because of the importance of the bridges. Like most old Italian cities, Piacenza had a lot of archways and a market square in the centre of town where the local people congregated. We had been in the Piacenza area only a couple of weeks when we received orders one evening that the new Italian government planned to make peace with the Allies and join the war against us, and that we were therefore to disarm the Italian army before it could be used against us. We had planned an artillery exercise for the next morning, and my artillery battalion had invited all the officers of the Italian artillery regiment stationed in Piacenza to join us in observing the exercise. We had attended some of their exercises, and this kind of reciprocation was a normal thing. Now, when they arrived to observe our exercises the next morning, we would have to disarm them and detain them as prisoners of war. It was an onerous duty that we did not look forward to. We'd had a very friendly relationship with them, and some of them even wore iron crosses they had won serving under German command in the African campaign. We felt personally that what we had been ordered to do would be an act of betrayal. But we had orders, and we had to carry them out. When their bus arrived with about 30 of them aboard the next morning, we apologetically told them we had been ordered to disarm them and the rest of the Italian army. So we now had most of the officers from their artillery regiment. Our infantry regiment was already in position around Piacenza, and my battery was about a couple of kilometres away. In the meantime, however, the remaining Italian forces had been ordered not to allow us to disarm them, and when our infantry approached them, they opened fire. Our infantry withdrew and asked for artillery support. Then a few Italian armoured cars approached us in a threatening manner, apparently mistaking the pullback of our infantry for a retreat. When our infantry fired on them, the armoured cars turned and fled. It looked as if we would have to take Piacenza by force, in spite of the fact that all the civilian population was still in the city. Because we wanted to avoid civilian casualties if possible, the infantry battalion commander and I decided to fire one salvo of artillery into Piacenza's market square to let them see what the city was going to be subjected to if we had to take it by force. The market square was empty, because the civilians knew that combat was likely to occur at any moment, and they were staying indoors. The Italian army had no chance of stopping us if we attacked, because they could not use their artillery. It was not in place, and we held most of their artillery officers. I prepared my guns and fired one salvo of 4 artillery shells into the market square. Then we waited. About 20 minutes later, a motorcycle with a senior officer in a sidecar came out, waving a white flag, to surrender the city to us. The artillery salvo had convinced them that it was useless to resist. We confined the Italian troops to their barracks, and our infantry took over security for the bridges over the Po River. It did not go quite as smoothly everywhere as it did in Piacenza. At Genoa and Savona, the Italian Navy was in charge of military operations, and it refused to submit peaceably. Those cities had to be taken by force, and there were losses on both sides. Our division took part in the fighting at Genoa, our infantry being moved quickly by trucks. The artillery was to follow, but it was mountainous country, and by the time we got to Genoa with our artillery, the fighting was over. The whole matter of disarming the Italian army lasted only a few days. In Italy, it was not really possible to use horses with artillery because of the mountains and the heat, so I took over the vehicles of a mechanized Italian artillery battery at Piacenza, and for the first time became mechanized. German forces in Italy were now 100% mechanized. In Russia, the figure was about 25%. In France, it was approximately 60%. Becoming mechanized after years as horse-drawn artillery was like assuming a completely different lifestyle. With horses, everyone, even the cannoneers, was affected by the constant attention to horses, feeding, watering, brushing, and otherwise caring for them, whereas we could just park mechanized equipment, turn the key off, and then forget about it until morning. We left our horses with local Italian farmers whom we paid to care for them until they could be returned to Germany. Finally, my dreams of being in the mechanized artillery had come true after 7 years in the army. After the fight at Genoa, we began occupation duty in Italy. Our division assigned individual sectors of occupation to different units. My battery was assigned an area of the Italian Riviera that was about 75 kilometers long. I was to share occupation responsibility for this area with a battalion of motorcycle-mounted cavalry that was commanded by Hauptmann Otto Beloff. Our mission was to guard against a possible Allied landing on the Italian Riviera. The Italians had built artillery into the mountainsides, and I took over their guns in addition to my own. This gave me enough guns for a battalion instead of a battery, although I still had the same number of men to man them. In an artillery duel with Allied battleships, however, we would have been badly outgunned. If the Allies had landed there, we would not have been strong enough to stop them for very long, but the Alps behind us presented them with a natural barrier. All the bridges, passes and tunnels in the Alps had been mined by the Italians, and it was part of our responsibility to blow them up in the event of an Allied landing we could not contain. My area of the Italian Riviera ran from Ventimiglia on the French border to Savona, a naval port, with Imperia falling roughly in the middle. I was responsible for the artillery, and Beloff was responsible for the infantry. I chose Imperia for my headquarters, and Beloff chose another village nearby. I found a beautiful abandoned villa that belonged to a friend of Mussolini's named Faravelli and moved into it. I was told that the owner was staying at another home he owned in the mountains. The villa had about 25 rooms. The bathrooms had both fresh water and seawater, and I could choose which I wanted to bathe in. The villa overlooked the Mediterranean, across a highway and a set of railroad tracks. I lived in the villa with my orderly and a motorcycle runner and had an office nearby. Our stay in Imperia was my most pleasant military duty of the war. Except for becoming familiar with the Italian guns and ammunition, we did not have a lot to do, since we were guarding against a possible but unlikely invasion. The biggest bother would normally have been the horses, and since we did not have to care for them any longer, life was relatively easy. Hauptmann Beloff and I even changed into civilian clothes once, because Monte Carlo was neutral in the war, and drove to the gambling casino at Monte Carlo. From Monaco we went on to Nice and then returned to Imperia. Our pleasant duty at Imperia was all too short. Allied forces landed at Salerno in September 1943, and General Feldmarschall Kesselring, commanding all German armed forces in the Mediterranean area, decided to use our division as part of an in-depth defence line across the boot of Italy, south of Rome, apparently on the assumption that the Allies could not invade Salerno and northern Italy at the same time. We received orders to board trains at 6:30 one morning, and we quickly learned that boarding trains is much easier with mechanized equipment than with horses. We went back through Piacenza and through the suburbs of Rome. The portion of the defence line, called the Gustav Line, assigned to us was north of Naples. 2 other divisions manned the other portion of the defence line. We unloaded from the train at Valerti and marched the last several kilometres, as usual. We went into the prepared line, which was still about 95 kilometres behind the front lines. Our defence line went through the town of Castelfort, but we avoided the town because it would have been such an inviting target and went to the hills south of the town instead. Our first job was to familiarise ourselves with the terrain and the area. We were to be ready and prepared so that if our infantry in the present front line near Naples could no longer hold, it could pull back behind our prepared line. When the Allies came, they would face fresh and rested infantry that was defending an in-depth prepared defence line, supported by artillery familiar with the terrain and all the possible targets in the area. While we held the line, the troops who had withdrawn behind the line would have a chance to rest and become reserve. It is very difficult for retreating troops to stop and turn around and fight again, especially if the opposing troops are pressing hard, as they should always do. So our function was to let our retreating troops through our line, and then to close the line and stop the pursuing enemy there. We were an army corps, with 3 divisions in the defence line and 1 in reserve. Our division had the section of the line that bordered the Tyrrhenian part of the Mediterranean. The division in the middle had the Monte Cassino area, and the 3rd division had the section that bordered on the Adriatic Sea. We were busy every day inspecting the area. The infantry had to look over every little creek and ravine in the area and put down a forward line, complete with trenches and foxholes. I had to establish the possible target areas for artillery support. I went through the area with the infantry and determined how they intended to defend, and then I set up my targets accordingly. We had time to do all this because the fighting was still well south of us. We were in mountainous country, which made it easy to defend, because enemy tanks were almost out of the question. Basically, the only way to attack us was on foot. When we had learned the area and settled into the new defence line, we just waited for the fighting to reach us. The infantry was dug in. Our guns were in an orange grove behind a little ridge, and everything was in place. We could see Mount Vesuvius from our position. The place and the weather were beautiful, and we had all the oranges from the trees in the orange grove we wanted as we waited. The women from the local villages would come to wash clothes in the streams near our position. We thought it would probably be 2 or 3 weeks before the fighting reached us. On November 19, 1943, I received a telegram that Lilo had given birth on November 12th to our son, Klaus Jürgen. The telegram also said that Lilo and the baby had had to flee from Leipzig after a terrible air raid, and that the baby was in a children's hospital in Braunschweig in poor condition. Since things at the front were quiet at the time, I was given a furlough to visit Lilo and the baby. When I left to go home, I took a whole trunk of oranges and a turkey with me, things that were very rare in Germany. When I arrived in Leipzig, I was stunned by the devastation that had been done to the city by an Allied air raid. What a contrast Leipzig presented to undamaged Rome, which I had just left. Since I had to change trains in Leipzig in order to get to Blankenburg, where Lilo was at her uncle's house, I went to my mother's home, changed into civilian clothes, left some of the oranges for her, and went on to Blankenburg, still carrying the remaining oranges and the turkey. When Lilo saw me, she threw herself into my arms and began to sob uncontrollably. Then she told me the whole story of Klaus Jürgen's birth. A few days after Klaus was born at a small private hospital, Leipzig was subjected to the most severe bombing raid it had experienced during the war because of its importance as a rail centre. The Allies dropped incendiary bombs, and large areas of Leipzig were burned. The hospital where Lilo and Klaus were was hit by incendiary bombs and set on fire. Lilo and Klaus stayed in the basement while people tried to put the fire out above them. They succeeded, but there was no longer any water or electricity, not just in the hospital, but in most of Leipzig. With neither water nor electricity, there was no way to sustain life. Lilo could not feed Klaus because there was no milk to be had. and she had an infection that made breastfeeding impossible. It was obvious that she would have to get out of the city immediately, or Klaus would surely die. Her mother suggested that they go to the home of her brother, Lilo's uncle, at Blankenberg in the Harz Mountains. The trip to Blankenberg by train normally took 4 hours, but this trip took more than 24 hours, not only because the bombing raid had disrupted the train service and damaged the tracks, but also because much of the population of Leipzig was evacuating the city. During the whole time, there was no food for Klaus and no beat in the train. When Lilo arrived in Blankenberg, Klaus was an extremely sick baby, and she knew she could not keep him in Blankenberg. He had to go to the nearest hospital in Braunschweig, which was about 60 kilometers away. She got an ambulance and took him to a children's hospital over very dangerous, icy roads. When they arrived at the hospital, a woman doctor examined Klaus. He was almost dead, and the doctor gave him no real chance to survive. He weighed less than he had at birth. Although he did not die, he clung to life for weeks with very little chance of survival. Lilo eventually had to leave Klaus at the hospital and return to Blankenberg. The ordeal she'd had to endure by herself was terrible, and only now did I learn the story. I comforted her, and found myself silently cursing the war that had done this to her and Klaus. We caught a train from Blankenberg to Braunschweig, where Klaus was hospitalized, and there, on January 8, 1944, I first saw my son. He was about 8 weeks old now, but he was still badly underweight and looked terrible. I had never seen a newborn baby before, but all the pictures of babies I had seen were of healthy, fat babies, and he looked incredibly small and sickly. Before I returned to Italy, we were lucky to find Lilo a place to stay. Her uncle in Blankenberg had 3 children, and she did not want to impose upon him any longer than necessary. We found a room for her in a doctor's home. The government required those who had extra rooms to rent them to those who had been bombed out of their homes. Klaus had to stay in the hospital several more weeks after I left, but his life was no longer in danger. He started to recover before I left, although it was quite some time before he looked fat and healthy. I left to return to Italy on January 24, 1944. As I returned through Leipzig and saw the burned-out and destroyed areas of the city, I knew the bombing was beginning to demoralize the population. The propaganda line that the bombing was just drawing people together and hardening their resolve was true because you hate the people who are doing this to you, but the bombing was also having a demoralizing effect, especially on workers who could not get enough sleep or rest because they had to keep going to air raid shelters during the night. They were beginning to just wish this was all over. When my train pulled into the station in Florence and I disembarked, German army officers were in the station directing everyone in a German uniform into a special area of the railroad station. The American army had landed at Anzio. We called this operation the Nettuno Bridgehead, because Nettuno was the main community in the landing zone, and with all our regular infantry divisions tied up at the front against the Allied forces moving north from the Salerno landing area, no troops were readily available to oppose them. So all military returning from furlough or convalescent leave were being collected at the major railroad stations to form makeshift units to try to contain the American forces at Anzio Nettuno until a regular infantry division could be brought in. As an officer, I was directed to go to a nearby hotel for further directions. All officers were interviewed to determine their experience, and I was placed in command of a battalion of 3 companies of makeshift infantry, including Navy and Air Force people who had infantry training. Florence was approximately 370 kilometers from Anzio. We went to Rome by bus, and then loaded aboard trucks for the rest of the trip. Army officers were waiting at Anzio to direct us into a defence line that was already being established. My battalion was assigned a section of the southeast side of the defence line around the landing area. I assigned a sector to each of my company commanders, held some troops in reserve, and waited to see what was going to happen. The defence line we were establishing was about 45 kilometres long in a half-circle around the American bridgehead. We had small arms, but we did not have tanks, artillery, or even machine guns. With inexperienced troops who had never worked together before and who were under strange officers, we would not have been a very effective fighting force at best, and without machine guns, mortars, tanks, or artillery, we would not have much of a chance if the Americans had attacked. But they did not attack. They just dug in. We waited for them to attack, and they apparently waited for reinforcements. It was the quietest battle scene I ever experienced. We saw their ships out at sea, with balloons tethered to the ships to protect them from attack by low-flying aircraft. The two enemy forces just sat and watched each other. A few days later, regular infantry arrived to replace us, and we returned to our own units. I am glad the American commanding general was not Patton, because an aggressive general could have taken Rome with very little effort at that time. Once they allowed us time to get real infantry into position opposite them, however, they had to fight fiercely for every foot of ground. As I approached the Gustav line on my way back to my battery, the fighting was raging near Cassino. About 35 kilometres away, I began to hear the heavy artillery, which sounded like a thunderstorm somewhere in the distance. Then, as I got closer, I began to hear the light artillery as well. Finally, as I got closer still, the sound of battle became the old, familiar, constant roar, with the sounds of mortars and machine guns and rifles in addition to the artillery. Always before, in France and in Russia, this constant roar of battle had been a natural part of my life at the front, and I had thought nothing of it. But this time was strangely different, and I found myself thinking, "Oh God, here we go again, with this constant day-to-day combat." I had never thought or felt that way before, and it never happened again. I had always controlled fear in the past. It may have been because I had just seen Klaus for the first time, had more to live for now than ever before, and was more keenly conscious of my own mortality than ever before. Perhaps it was because I had been out of combat for some time. Or perhaps it was because we were obviously going to lose the war. For whatever reason, returning to the front was extremely unnerving for me this time. When I reported to my battalion commander, Major Nikisch, he greeted me with a huge smile. "What would be your greatest desire, Knapper?" he asked. "That this war would be over," I said wearily. "After that?" he prompted. I looked at him. He obviously had news for me. "You have been selected for General Staff training," he said. "Congratulations." I was tremendously pleased and proud, because being selected for General Staff training was the greatest honour a junior officer in the German army could receive. You could not ask for it. You could only be selected for it. Probably one of the reasons I had been selected was my ranking of 24th in my 1938 graduating class of 4,000 at the 4 military academies. By then, my number had changed from 24 to 12, which meant that half of those above me were either dead or very badly wounded. A chilling statistic. Probably most of them were dead, having been killed in Poland, France, Russia, North Africa, or Italy. A replacement had already been selected to take over my battery, and I was assigned to the staff of the neighbouring 71st Infantry Division to begin on-the-job General Staff training. General Staff training was in 3 stages. The first stage was on-the-job work, during which the trainee was progressively assigned to a division, corps, army and army group, to learn by direct observation what General Staff work was all about. The second stage was a series of short specialised schools on tank warfare, artillery, engineering and so forth, to provide the trainee with the broad knowledge of all types of military operations necessary for good staff work. The third stage was the General Staff College, which was designed to teach the trainee to lead a division in combat. During the on-the-job training, one of the first things learned was that as part of a staff, one of my responsibilities was to know all the key people in the division. As a battery commander, I needed to know only my own battalion commander and the other battery commanders in my battalion in addition to the infantry commanders we had to support. But now I learned that a division staff must know all the regiment commanders, the ranking artillery commanders and so forth. I spent the first day getting to know people, studying our positions on the maps, and going over the division's plans for the defence of its section of the Gustav Line. Some fighting was going on, and the division's operations officer briefed me on what was happening, where our positions were, and who the commanders were. I was assigned to spend a few days with the operations officer, just observing his duties and functions. I could take some phone calls, but mostly I was just observing. Then I spent a few days with the intelligence officer and then with the quartermaster, just observing the functions and duties of each. Then I spent a few days with the operations officer, dealing directly with the division's regiment commanders. I observed what the different people were doing, how they received reports from the regiments, and how they put them together and sent a report to the corps. I could occasionally relieve people, but it was mostly learning by observing. Although I had been a battalion adjutant and worked briefly on a higher staff at Rostov, I had basically always been a frontline officer and did not know a great deal about staff work. While I was with the division staff, the battle for Cassino was taking place. The Allies were trying to break through there for a drive on Rome, and the battle went on for days. My division headquarters had a panoramic view over the whole valley, and watching the American bombing of the monastery at Monte Cassino was almost like watching a movie on a screen. I was assigned to the staff of the 14th Panzer Corps, where I repeated the experience, getting to know the division commanders and so forth. As part of a corps staff, I met all the key officers of each division, and I met the neighbouring corps staff people as well. I learned that corps staff people should always know their neighbours personally because they have to deal with them frequently. I learned that if I knew someone personally, it was different from having only talked to him on the phone, and that knowing personally the people I had to deal with was very important in general staff work. I learned that it was also important to notice what military decorations those people wore, because that told me a great deal about their character and their general capability. A division commander who wore the Knight's Cross with swords was a very experienced and proven frontline commander compared to one who wore only the Iron Cross. I visited the division staff, people with the corps staff officers, when they inspected their positions to make sure everything was ready for when the fighting hit us. In April 1944, I joined the staff of General Feldmarschall Kesselring, who commanded all German forces, Army, Navy and Air Force, in the Mediterranean area. His headquarters was located in tunnels inside a mountain chain north of Rome. At the appointed time, I reported to Kesselring's Chief of Staff, General Westphal, who congratulated me on my selection for General Staff training and wished me good luck. Kesselring's operations officer found quarters for me in the tunnel and assigned me to a job. Somebody was on furlough, so they put me in his job, under another officer's supervision, since I did not know the job. So here I had work to do instead of just observing. My job was to receive the reports from the various armies and put them together into one report for the operations officer and the Chief of Staff. In the higher staff, this is night work, because the higher the staff, the later you get these reports. At the end of the day, the battalion reports to the regiment, which then reports to the division, which reports to the corps, which reports to the army, which finally reports to the army group, and all this consolidating and summarizing and passing on of reports takes time. Several different tunnels connected inside the main tunnel, and in these connecting tunnels were wooden barracks that were divided into offices and living quarters. The barracks actually had roofs and windows, just as if they were outside, because they were prefabricated. I could sometimes see rats scurrying outside the windows on the side that was against the wall of the tunnel. Outside the wooden barracks on the opposite side was a hallway, and beyond it was the opposite wall of the tunnel. I had a small room to sleep in, and I shared an office with several other officers. Approximately 250 people were living and working in the tunnel. It was a very interesting time for me. For the first time I knew what was going on not just at my own front or part of it, but at all fronts. I also spent some time with the quartermaster of our army group. We would occasionally go to Rome on business, which gave me a chance to see a little of that city. Until then, I had only been through the train station in Rome. I was able to see some of the tourist sites, like the Colosseum and the Forum, on these trips. During the night, I would work to help summarize all the reports so that new orders could be issued very early the next morning. Then, after daylight, I would often go outside, climb up above the tunnel entrance a few dozen meters, and sunbathe and get a little fresh air. A number of other people would do the same thing. One morning, after I had been with Kesselring's staff about 3 weeks, I finished my work at 6 km. I had some breakfast and went outside for some fresh air and sun, climbing up the mountainside above the mouth of the tunnel. I planned to stay out for an hour or two, sleeping and getting a tan at the same time. The terrain was rocky with a few scrub bushes. It was a beautiful day, with clear blue skies and lots of sunshine, and a half-dozen or so other people were scattered about the area, getting sun and fresh air. About half an hour later, the air raid siren began to wail. This happened frequently because there was fairly constant Allied air traffic overhead, and since the Allied bombers had always before been on their way somewhere else, I paid little attention to the sirens. Then I realized that the sirens had become constant, which was an indication that this was serious. I rolled over onto my back and searched the skies for the airplanes. They were very high, which indicated to me that they were again on their way somewhere else until I saw something glittering beneath them. Then I realized they were dropping bombs. I jumped up and tried to run for the tunnel, but it was too late. The bombs were already exploding about me. I threw myself to the ground and tried to hug the earth, which began to boil violently all around me with the explosions, and I could feel the heat of the blasts wash over me with each ear-shattering explosion. I dug my face deeper into the earth, trying to burrow into it, squeezing my eyes shut and clenching my teeth. I thought my luck had finally run out. Suddenly it was very quiet. When I opened my eyes, the world was completely dark. Smoke and powder and dust obscured the sky and the sun. I knew I was still alive, because I could smell the smoke and burned powder, and I was conscious of thinking, but I could see nothing. Then the sky began to hail rocks that had been blasted into the air by the bombs, and I covered the back of my head with my hands and endured the avalanche. Slowly, a little light began to seep through the darkness, and suddenly it occurred to me that bombers always came in 2 waves. The second wave can see the results of the first and make corrections. I knew I had to get out of there fast or risk enduring the same horror again. Although I could not see more than 3 meters in the darkness, I knew the tunnel was downhill somewhere, and I jumped to my feet and made a dash down the hill. When I hit the road leading to the tunnel, I knew I had to turn left. Then I saw the entrance to the tunnel and leapt for it, but my legs suddenly failed me and I fell into the tunnel entrance. Some people there picked me up and carried me to a first aid station. Then the second wave of bombers came, and the tunnel shook and vibrated from the impact of the bombs. I did not feel any pain, although I was covered with blood. I knew I had been hit by all those falling rocks, and I knew I had felt the heat blast of the bombs and was probably burned, but I was not aware of much else. In such a situation, a soldier just wants to be safe, and he does not care about anything else. He reacts first, and the pain comes later. He feels that something is wrong, but it is not a localized pain. Only when he is out of danger does he begin to feel pain. The medics began to clean and treat my back for the relatively minor rock and burn wounds, and then they discovered that a piece of shrapnel from a bomb had taken a huge chunk out of the calf of my left leg. It was a very deep flesh wound, almost to the bone, but I was fortunate because the bone had not been broken, no artery had been severed, and no nerve had been cut. When I saw that the blood was dark red and not coming out in spurts, I knew that was a good sign. Of the half-dozen or so of us who were up there, 2 were never found. Evidently they had both taken direct hits. The rest of us were all wounded. The medics patched us up the best they could and arranged for us to be taken to a field hospital about 3 kilometers away. When I arrived at the field hospital, I was immediately given a tetanus shot, which was standard procedure for anyone who had been wounded by shrapnel or bullets. I had been given tetanus shots before with no ill effects, but not this time. I was allergic to the type of tetanus serum they gave me, and I started breaking out in wet running sores. They itched, they burned, they hurt, and they were all over my body. I could not sleep because of the pain and the itching. I could not get comfortable in any position. I could hardly eat or drink for 4 days because I had sores in my mouth. They were even inside my nose. This was the worst medical experience of my life, and the doctors became very concerned. They gave me calcium shots as an antidote, and after another day or two, the rash started to clear up. The Allies had begun their offensive in the meantime and were threatening to break through our defence lines. The bombing and strafing around us at the field hospital were becoming intense. Of course, some of the local population was spying on us, and the location of Kesselring's headquarters was no secret to the Allies. They knew that any German military vehicle could contain staff officers or supplies, so fighter planes chased and strafed every vehicle. From the window of my hospital room, I could see the roads and the tunnel entrance, and I could see this action taking place. Although the Allied fighter pilots honoured the big red cross on the roof of the hospital, they attacked everything that moved on the road. They now bombed the tunnel entrance regularly, apparently trying to seal it shut. The army decided to start evacuating patients from the field hospital since the fighting was getting close, so they put 4 of us in an ambulance and we started toward Florence with a driver and a medical corpsman. Of the 4 of us, 2 were severely wounded and bedfast, and 1 was out of his mind from too much combat or from a shell exploding too close to him. I was in the best shape with my leg wound. When we were about halfway to Florence, we were attacked by 2 American fighter planes. The ambulance was clearly marked with a red cross on the roof, but the pilots either did not believe it was really an ambulance or they were just having fun by trying to scare us. When they made the first strafing run, the ambulance driver stopped the ambulance and he and the corpsman ran for cover. The 4 of us who were wounded were left in the ambulance, just sitting there helplessly. The 2 who were severely wounded could not stand, and I could barely hobble. The crazy man went berserk, and I had to hold him down to keep him from hurting the others. I tried to talk to him and calm him down as I held him. He was just a boy, and he was very frightened. The planes made several passes. We could see the splashes in the road where the 50 caliber bullets hit all around us, but they never hit us. Either the pilots were very poor marksmen, or they were just playing cat and mouse with us and never intended to hit us. Although they may just have been having fun, it was a terrifying experience for us. The hospital at Florence had been converted from the Italian Air Force's military academy. It was a beautiful place, with magnificent buildings and a pool. Now it was a normal military hospital, with many wounded from the fighting. Young Italian girls visited us. Although the Italian government had joined the Allies in the war against us, a part of the Italian population still sympathized with us and did not like what their government had done. I practiced my Italian with them. I was in a room with 10 or 12 others. We learned while I was there that the Allies had landed at Normandy on June 6, 1944. This was the 3rd front for us, but of course the news given us was that the Allies had been beaten back with terrible losses. After the first few days, we could sense that things were not going well for us there. We were given no details except that Cherbourg was holding out, and this was deceptive because Cherbourg was on the coast. But then we began to hear about heroic resistance, and we knew that things were going badly for us in France. In addition, we were being pushed up the Italian peninsula, and the Russians were advancing on us from the east. It was evident that the end was approaching. After I had been there almost 4 weeks, even Florence was being threatened as the front came closer, and the army decided to evacuate this hospital also. By then I could walk, although I still had a cast on my leg, and I got permission to go by train to the hospital in Leipzig. Lilo was back in Leipzig with her mother now. I arrived there in late June 1944. Klaus was finally beginning to look fat and healthy, like a normal baby, and I was very glad to see that. Lilo, of course, was happy to have me home again. She had learned almost to look forward to my being wounded, as long as it was not too serious, so I would get to come home. I reported to the hospital regularly, as usual, to have my leg inspected and treated and for physical therapy. My wound was healing on the outside, but not on the inside. Consequently, it appeared to be healing quite nicely for a while, but then it broke open again. Apparently, a big flesh wound like that should be kept open so it heals from the inside out instead of from the outside in. The first of my specialised weapons schools, the second part of General Staff training, was scheduled to begin in early July but was delayed for a few days. I should not have gone back to active duty that quickly, but General Staff training was too great an honour and opportunity to miss, so I convinced the doctors that my leg would heal just as well in a classroom as it would at home. The fact that it looked as if we had already lost the war and I would not be able to pursue my career for very long did not detract from the honour of being selected to attend the General Staff College. It never occurred to me, right up to the bitter end, to do anything differently because we were losing the war. My whole career as a professional army officer had been aimed at attending the General Staff College if possible. Because of my eagerness for the General Staff training, however, my leg did not heal properly. I should have stayed at home and given my leg time to heal, but I did not. So, although walking with a cane, I started the specialised weapons schools. The first of the specialised schools started in mid-July 1944. There were a number of them we had to attend: Panzer School, Communications School, Artillery School, Engineering School, and so forth. We did not have to attend the school in our own specialty, so when it came time to attend Artillery School, I would get to go home instead. Between schools, I would have to report back to the hospital in Leipzig to have my wound inspected, although at the schools I could have the bandages changed at the dispensary. We had 2 months to complete the various specialised schools because the main General Staff College started in September. Although we were all experienced officers with much time in combat by then, we needed more exposure to the things in which we did not have direct experience. Lilo was able to go with me to some of these schools, including the first one, the Panzer School in Bergen, near Celle. We were at the Panzer School on July 20th, 1944, when Oberst E.G. Klaus von Stauffenberg attempted to assassinate Hitler, and the Nazi Party leaders went berserk. The next several days were total chaos throughout Germany. Nobody knew what would happen next or who would be arrested next. The government and the army were both in a constant state of uproar. There were endless whispered names and some announcements on the radio. It was at least a week before the situation showed any signs of abating. Von Stauffenberg, who had planted a bomb under Hitler's table at a situation meeting at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, and then immediately left for Berlin to help take over the government, was a General Staff officer, and many of the group of conspirators involved in the plot to kill Hitler were General Staff officers. Unfortunately for him and the other conspirators, the bomb did not kill Hitler, and Stauffenberg was arrested and executed in Berlin. Immediately, everybody in the General Staff was under suspicion. The Nazi Party leaders were particularly vocal and vicious in accusing General Staff officers. They did not like army officers in general, and they particularly hated General Staff officers. The Minister of Labour, Robert Ley, was especially nasty. He ranted and raved and spewed hate in tirades on the radio, in newspapers, and in speeches in factories. He had an almost pathological hatred of General Staff officers who came from the nobility, and when we heard him on the radio ranting and raving about General Staff officers, blue-blooded and inbred to idiocy, we thought there was not much hope of our training continuing, and we would probably be lucky if we were not arrested because we were in General Staff training. We thought that at best the General Staff College would be abandoned, we would all be reassigned to the front, and there would be no more General Staff. Many of our instructors at the General Staff College were concerned for their lives because they knew some of the convicted General Staff officers. It was a very critical time for General Staff officers, especially those who had been in General Staff work for some time. An officer could be arrested because a friend or relative had been arrested. I was safe because I had always been a front-line officer and was new to the General Staff, But even some junior officers were arrested because they had been on an implicated general's staff for some time and had become confidants of the general. Because I had spent 3 weeks on Kesselring's staff, some of the names being mentioned were familiar to me. Everybody knew someone who had been arrested, and with the Nazis' system of holding a man's family responsible if he did something wrong, even families were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Von Stauffenberg and the others who had been caught had been shot immediately. Now came the trials of all the others, and that news was constantly in the newspapers and on the radio. Rommel's death was announced, but it was attributed to injuries he had received during a strafing attack in France. Because he was so popular with the German people, his death was not connected with the assassination attempt in the news. After a week or so, the situation began to calm down a little. The rest of the Panzer school course was cancelled and could not be rescheduled, but we were told that our next school would take place. Personally, I felt that it would have been good if the assassination attempt had succeeded, because it could possibly have ended the war under better terms than the unconditional surrender the Allies were insisting upon. It was an opinion I shared with only one other person, Hauptmann Heiner Engel, a fellow student whom I had just met, but who had quickly become a close and trusted friend. After the assassination attempt, the army was forced to adopt the Nazi salute. The Nazi salute had been used indoors when we were not wearing a hat since I had joined the army in 1936. Now, however, we were forced to abandon the normal military salute and adopt the Nazi salute exclusively. It was arranged by the Nazi Party, who wanted to show the army that they were in charge, and Hitler agreed to it. Political officers were also forced on the army after the assassination attempt. The Nazi Party leaders wanted to know what was going on everywhere in the army now, and this was their way of achieving that objective. They recruited reserve officers for this position. Regular army officers were prohibited from political activity. All political officers had been Nazi Party members before entering the army. They were officially called National Socialist Guidance Officers. They would be placed in a position to watch commanding officers. If a commander failed to follow orders to fight to the last man, his political officer would report this to the Nazi Party, who would take action to have the commander relieved of his command. Their official responsibility was keeping up the ideological spirit of the soldiers. They used the patriotic approach rather than a political approach, although when conditions permitted they would give lessons on political subjects and an occasional pep talk. The General Staff College was scheduled to begin September 20th, 1944, after the specialized schools had all been completed. It had been moved from Berlin to Hirschberg, in the Sudeten mountains of Silesia. We were invited to bring our families. Married officers were provided 2 rooms, with 1 kitchen for every 4 families. Since we all ate in the officers' club, that was not a great inconvenience. On most evenings I had homework, but there were occasional parties with most or all of the married officers. Of course, the times were terrible, but Hirschberg was almost an oasis in the war. There were no air raids, and it was a nice town in a beautiful area. The General Staff College was much like Kriegsschule Potsdam had been, except at a senior level. At Hirschberg, the commander of the General Staff College was a general lieutenant, whereas the commander of the military academy at Potsdam had been an Oberst. At Hirschberg, the working group was about 20 Hauptmanns and Majors, and was headed by an Oberst IG, whereas the working group at Potsdam had been about 24 Fähnrichs and was headed by a Major. At Hirschberg, we learned to lead a division in combat, whereas we had learned at Potsdam to lead a battalion in combat. The Oberst IG in charge of my group at Hirschberg was named Jostermann. We learned how to lead a division in different kinds of combat situations: attacking, retreating, conducting a rearguard action, attacking across a river, attacking in mountainous terrain, establishing a bridgehead, attacking a bridgehead, and so forth. All these different situations were played out with maps or in a sandbox, with tests in between. The purpose was to make us capable of assisting a general in leading a division. We learned how to write orders, how to plan an attack, how to figure out the length of a column on a road, how long it would take the column to cross a bridge, how to group troops, how to arrange for reserves, how to defend against a massive attack by an enemy, how to conduct a massive attack against a defence line, how to position infantry, how to position artillery, where to put the engineers if there is a river in the attack line, and when to move them forward. We also learned intelligence and counterintelligence work, how to find out what kind of units were opposite us, and what to do with that information, how to handle all these details for the general commanding the division. In war games, we would be given the situation we were in and what was happening. Then all of a sudden something unexpected would happen, which we would learn about in a report, a radio message, or a phone call. Then we would have to react to the new situation. In regular training, we would get the information and have to work out the solution overnight or over the weekend. In all situations, pressure was applied, because in combat you are always under extreme pressure. It was very much like Potsdam, but on a larger scale, and it was highly interesting. In peacetime, general staff training, including on-the-job training, the specialised schools, and the General Staff College, was a 2-year programme. In our case, it was condensed. I spent about 3.5 months in on-the-job training, 2 months in the specialised schools, and 4 months in the General Staff College, for a total of less than a year. Life is completely different in wartime than in peacetime. For one thing, we all had a great deal of combat experience, which peacetime officers would not have. For another, there was no significant social aspect to the training now, and social graces had been an important part of the peacetime general staff training. Our only social activity was a once-a-month event during which the whole school would have an evening in the ballroom, consisting of a cocktail hour and dinner. The Eastern Front was not far from Hirschberg, and as the school continued, it came even closer. It was very clear now that none of us could possibly have a prolonged career as a professional army officer. We knew the war could not last much longer, and we could not win it. But until the government decided to end the war, or until we were totally defeated, the army could only continue to function normally, which included training general staff officers. We also thought there was a possibility that the Western powers would join us to defeat Russia. It did not make sense to us that they would not want to stop Russia as much as we did in order to prevent them from dominating Europe after the war. At Christmas, Lilo's parents came to visit us. Her father was home on furlough from Italy, where he served in a quartermaster unit, and they stayed in a nearby hotel for a few days. It was not a joyous Christmas under the circumstances. There was not much available in the stores in the way of gifts, but at least the army provided us with good food, so we had it better than most people in Germany at the time. The war was lost, and now we had to think of what would come next. To us, the Western democracies were not as threatening as the Soviet Union. Part of the reason was that most of the government propaganda was directed against the Soviet Union, with hardly any against the Western democracies. Part of it was because we had invaded Russia, and we knew the Russians would be terrible in their revenge, even though we did not know yet of the brutality of the Nazi Party people in Russia after the front lines had passed through. Part of it was also the things we discovered the Russians had done whenever we recaptured territory they had taken from us. In the West, things were terrible during the fighting, but the fighting lasted only a few days, and then it was over. There were, of course, casualties among civilians, but they ended when the fighting ended. That was not true in the war against the Russians. There, when the fighting ended, the brutalization of German civilians began, especially the women. The raping and the killing were wanton. The famous and influential Russian writer Ilya Ehrenburg encouraged the widespread raping of German women by writing, "Soldiers of the Red Army, the German women are yours." Since Ilya Ehrenburg was officially sanctioned by the Soviet government, the Russian soldiers took his announcement as coming from the Kremlin. As 1945 began, the menacing shadow of Russian domination lay over Germany like an ugly poisonous cloud, seeping into our minds and clinging there as stubbornly as a wet fog on a gloomy winter morning. The irony of our certainty that Russia would never be able to invade Germany came home now with appalling force. The Russians had reached the Vistula, and were preparing their great final offensive into the heart of Germany. East Prussia had already been overrun by Russian troops, and the Battle of the Bulge had failed in the west. The end of the war was very near. It seemed to me that the government should be suing for peace, that even unconditional surrender would be better than having Germany destroyed. But I knew that the same man who had ordered masses of German soldiers to stand and die rather than retreat would not now negotiate a peaceful end to the war. Even being at the General Staff College and able to live with Lilo and Klaus in Hirschberg, relatively secure even from air raids, could not lift my drooping spirits. We were preparing for our final exam, part of which was supposed to be a field trip to Mecklenburg, but we were sure that by then the Russians would in fact be where the war games would fictionally place the enemy for tactical purposes. My exam topic was to be establishing a bridgehead from forward motion. Classroom routine was influenced more and more by the real events at the fronts, however, and the real battles taking place at the fronts were of much greater interest to us than the war games being staged in the classroom. Those of us at the General Staff College became more and more irritable as we tried to find ways to cope with what was happening to Germany. From time to time, I would go to hear a pianist or singer or to see a movie. As January wore on and the Soviets drove from the Vistula River toward the Oder River, classroom activity became more and more irregular. On January 20th, General Feldmarschall Schörner took over the Army Group Center from General Oberst Harp. As the end of the month approached, regular classroom activity ceased, except for a class in Nazi ideology. Instead, the class periods were spent listening to the news on the radio and discussing the situation at the various fronts. The Russians were pouring into West Prussia, Upper Silesia, and Pomerania. They soon were at Breslau and the Moravian Gate. At Steinau, they achieved their first thrust over the Oder River, almost causing a panic at the General Staff College. On January 23rd, because the army desperately needed manpower of all kinds, some of us were selected by the personnel department of the army in Berlin to fill assignments even before our training ended. I was among that group, assigned to report to the 6th Mountain Division in Norway as quartermaster. I was informed shortly before noon that I was to leave the next morning. I dreaded telling Lilo, who was 3 months pregnant with our second child. This meant not only that I had to leave suddenly, but that she would have to be responsible for moving all our household, in addition to herself and Klaus, back to Leipzig. When I told her, she tried to be brave, but began to cry. She could not control her tears, and soon she was sobbing uncontrollably. It broke my heart to see her this way. I tried to console her, but nothing seemed to help. Her body was racked with sobs. We were both helpless to do anything, and our personal problems were tiny compared to what was happening in the world. In the late afternoon, Lilo began to hemorrhage. Fearing a miscarriage, I put in a panic call for a physician. When he arrived, he confirmed my fears that a miscarriage was a very real possibility.